I want to begin with the water bucket, not with the woman, not with the winter, not with the walls she built that changed how a county survived the cold, but with the bucket. A plain tin bucket, 8 inches across, that sat on the packed earth floor beside the north door of a sod house 7 miles northwest of Salina, Kansas. Every morning of the previous winter, Sigrid Halverson had broken the ice in that bucket before she could give her boys their first drink of water. Every morning, from November through March, she had lifted the small hatchet she kept on the nail beside the door and struck the surface once, twice, sometimes 3 times before the ice gave way and the dark water showed beneath it. She had accepted this the way you accept the conditions of a place you have chosen to live in. The bucket froze. You broke the ice. The boys drank. You fed the stove and started the day, but she had not stopped thinking about it. In January of 1878, the worst freeze in the recorded history of Saline County pressed down on the Kansas prairie for 11 consecutive days. The temperature fell to 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit and held there with a persistence that felt, to the people enduring it, less like weather than like a decision. Across the county, cattle died in their pens. 2 elderly men were found dead in their homes. The fires in their stoves burned to ash. A family of 4 survived 4 days under a collapsed roof, frostbitten and barely conscious, before a neighbor found them in the white silence. In the sod house 7 miles northwest of Salina, the water bucket did not freeze. I am Dr. Theodore Marsh, formerly of Salina, Kansas, now of Topeka, where my granddaughter was born, and where my knees have finally negotiated a settlement with the prairie winters I put them through for 11 years. I am 71 years old. I am dictating this to my granddaughter Clara on an October afternoon in 1901 because she asked me, with the directness of a 17-year-old who has not yet learned that some questions make old men quiet, who was the most interesting person I treated in my career. I did not answer immediately. I said, "There was a woman in Saline County who built a house inside her house." Let me tell you what I mean by that. To understand what Sigrid Halverson built, you must first understand what she had to work with, which is to say you must understand the sod house, not as a symbol of frontier hardship, which is how it tends to appear in the accounts written by people who never lived in one, but as an engineering object with specific properties, specific strengths, and specific, sometimes fatal, limitations. The settlers who came to Saline County in the 1870s found a prairie that offered them almost nothing in the way of conventional building material. There was no stone worth quarrying within practical distance. There was almost no timber. What there was, in quantities that appeared inexhaustible, was grass, bluestem and Indian grass, and switchgrass, growing on a root system so dense and interlocked that the top 12 inches of prairie soil held together like a woven mat. The settlers cut this mat into blocks with a breaking plow and stacked the blocks like bricks, root side up, into walls 2 feet thick. They roofed the walls with cottonwood poles and more sod. They floored the interior with packed earth. The result was a structure that cost almost nothing to build, that resisted the prairie wind with the passive stubbornness of something that was itself made of the prairie, and that maintained a middling interior temperature through the action of its thick earthen walls. In mild winters, this was sufficient. The walls of a sod house are not, however, a sealed system. They breathe. Moisture moves through them in both directions, outward in summer, inward in winter, and over several seasons of freezing and thawing, the internal structure of the sod shifts and loosens, opening pathways for air that were not there when the blocks were first cut and stacked. A sod house built in 1873 is not the same house in 1877. It is the same shape. It is not the same barrier. I understood this in the abstract, the way a man with a medical education understands things he has read about but not yet seen fail. What I did not understand, until I began riding circuit through Saline County in the winters of the mid-1870s, was what the failure looked like from the inside. It looked like a family burning twice the wood they could reasonably afford, and maintaining an interior temperature that would not have been considered adequate for livestock in the settled counties of Pennsylvania. It looked like children sleeping in their coats. It looked like a small tin hatchet kept on a nail beside the door. Lars Halvorsen had built his sod house in the summer of 1873, 4 years after bringing his family from Vestfold, on the western shore of the Oslo Fjord, to a quarter-section claim on the Kansas prairie. He was a deliberate man, a carpenter by training, and he built the walls with a carpenter's attention to level and plumb that most of his neighbors did not bother with. The courses were even, the corners were true. The cottonwood roof frame was mortised and pegged, not simply lashed, and it held through 4 years of prairie wind without settling. In the autumn of his 4th year on the claim, Lars began a project he did not finish. On the north face of the house, the wall that took the full force of the winter wind, he began laying a second outer skin of sod blocks, set 2 feet beyond the original wall, intending to create a cavity between the 2 faces that he planned to fill with something, though he had not yet decided with what. He had noticed, in the way that a man who has built things notices, that the north wall was colder than the south. He had a carpenter's instinct that 2 walls were better than 1. He laid 3 courses before the October freeze came earlier than expected, and the ground hardened and the project stopped. He died of typhoid fever the following autumn, in 9 days, before he could return to it. The 3 courses of unfinished sod sat on the north face of the house through the winter that nearly killed Tomas, and through the summer that followed, going nowhere, doing nothing, a fragment of an idea that its builder had taken with him when he went. Sigrid looked at those 3 courses every day. She was 34 years old when Lars died, and she was the kind of woman who organized grief the way she organized everything else, by understanding exactly what it consisted of and deciding which parts of it she could act on. The loss was real, and she did not minimize it, but she was not a woman who confused feeling a thing with being unable to think. Lars was dead. The claim required residence and continuous improvement, or it reverted to the government. She had 2 sons, Eric, who was 9, and Tomas, who was 5, and a prairie winter coming that the oldest settlers in the county were already describing, in the particular understated manner of people who have seen bad things and prefer not to alarm others, as one that bore watching. She was not going to leave. The land was the future. There was no other future she could see from where she stood, and the walls were not good enough. She knew this with the certainty of a woman who had spent 2 winters in them and had the hatchet marks on the ice bucket to prove it. The walls that Lars had built carefully and plumb and true were not, after 4 years of prairie weather, sufficient to keep 2 small boys safe through a Kansas January if the January decided to be serious about it. She did not know exactly why they were failing. She knew that they were, and she knew that knowing why was the necessary step before knowing what to do. She began in the spring and summer of 1877 to pay a different kind of attention to the world around her. A meadowlark's nest is not a remarkable object. Any child who has walked through a Kansas meadow in June has seen them. A deep cup of woven grass set into a slight hollow in the ground, roofed over with an arching canopy of more grass, the entrance oriented away from the prevailing wind. They are common. They blend into the ground so thoroughly that you can step within a foot of one without seeing it. Sigrid found one in June at the edge of her wheat field, and she crouched beside it for a long time without touching it, because there were eggs inside and she did not want to disturb them. She was not in that moment thinking about her house. She was thinking about the eggs and the bird that had built around them. What she noticed was simple. The nest was made of the same dry grass that covered the entire field. It was materially indistinguishable from its surroundings. Grass laid upon grass, nothing exotic, nothing that required skill to obtain. And yet the inside of the nest, when she held one finger very carefully through the entrance without touching the eggs, was warm. Distinctly, specifically warm, in a way that the open air around the nest, on the same June morning, was not. She held her finger there and thought about it. 2 walls of grass, she said to herself, with the practical precision she applied to most things. Nothing between them but trapped air. The inside is warm because the walls stop the air from moving, and still air holds warmth that moving air carries away. She stood up and looked at Lars's 3 unfinished courses on the north face of the house. She looked at them for a long time. Then she went back to work and she thought about what she had seen for the rest of the summer. When she came to Gunderson's store in late August with her list, cottonwood nails, 2 bolts of muslin, a paper of small furniture tacks, Niels Gunderson read the list twice before he looked up at her. He was a careful man, Gunderson, a Bergen native who had been in Kansas for 15 years and who kept his store as a place where the Norwegian families of the county could gather information along with their cornmeal and tobacco. He understood his community's business without involving himself in it, which was a distinction he maintained with some discipline. "What are you building, Sigrid?" she told him in the brief and organized way she had. A frame of cottonwood poles set inside the north and west walls, a cavity of 8 inches packed with dry grass, a second layer of muslin stretched over the frame. Gunderson set the list down on the counter. "The walls are already 2 feet thick." 2 feet of wet sod with gaps in it, she said. "The north wall has been breathing cold air since February. I can feel it through a wool glove." He thought about this for a moment. He was not a man who dismissed practical reasoning, but he was also a man who had watched many settlers try things that made a certain kind of sense and fail in ways that also made a certain kind of sense. "Prairie grass and muslin won't stop a Kansas January. Still air will," she said. "The grass holds the air still. Still air doesn't carry cold the way moving air does." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard an argument he cannot immediately counter, but is not yet certain he believes. He filled the order. He charged her fare. When she had gone, he stood at the window and watched her load the wagon with the particular efficiency of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and has only come to town for the material to do it. He told me later, when I asked him how the story had first come to his attention, that he had thought about her list for several days afterward, not because he thought it would fail, because something in the logic of it, 2 walls, still air, a meadowlark's nest, had settled into his thinking and refused to leave. By September, Sigrid Halvorsen had begun to pack her walls. Nobody in Saline County knew yet whether it would work. She knew what she had built. She knew what the meadowlark knew. She was waiting for January to confirm it. There is a kind of thinking that does not look like thinking. It looks like a woman walking the perimeter of her house on a Tuesday morning in March, running one hand along the exterior sod wall while the other holds her shawl closed against the wind. It looks like stopping at the northwest corner and pressing a palm flat against the surface, and then walking to the southeast corner and pressing the same palm against that surface and standing very still, comparing what the hand reports from one place to the other. It looks, to anyone watching from the road, like nothing in particular, a woman touching her own house. Nothing to remark upon. Olaf Berge remarked upon it. He was riding past the Halvorsen claim on a March morning in 1877 when he saw Sigrid at the north wall, her palm against the sod, her eyes directed at some middle distance that had nothing to do with the horizon. Berge was 52 years old, a telemark man, broad across the shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who had built something from nothing and survived long enough to consider his methods confirmed. He had been in Kansas for 9 years. He had survived 3 hard winters in a sod house of his own construction and considered himself, with some justification, a man who knew what the prairie required of those who wanted to live on it. He pulled up his horse at the fence line. "Something wrong with the wall, Sigrid?" She looked at him without removing her hand from the surface. "The north wall is colder than the south," she said. "I'm trying to understand how much colder." Berge looked at the wall. He looked at Sigrid. He looked at the wall again. "It faces north," he said, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who has perhaps not thought it all the way through. The south wall faces south. That's why one is colder. Yes, Sigrid said, but I want to know by how much, and whether it changes by season, and what the difference is between the surface and the interior. Berge had no answer for this, because these were not questions he had thought to ask. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a conversation has moved into territory he does not intend to follow it into, and rode on. I did not witness this exchange. Gunderson told it to me, having heard it from Berg himself, some months later, after the winter had finished making its argument, and Berg was in a mood to reassess several of his prior certainties. I include it here because it is the earliest recorded evidence of Sigrid Halvorsson's method, which was not inspiration and was not luck, but was the slow accumulation of specific physical knowledge about a specific physical problem gathered over an entire season before she touched a single tool. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She had the schooling available to a girl in a Norwegian coastal town in the 1850s, which was reading, figures, and the practical curriculum of a household that required everyone in it to understand how things worked. What she had beyond this was the habit, formed early and never relinquished, of treating the physical world as a source of information rather than a backdrop. Things told you things if you asked them correctly. A wall told you where the cold was coming from. A bird's nest told you what stopped it. The North Wall observation had begun the previous winter in the worst weeks of February, when Sigrid had noticed that the interior surface of the North Wall was not merely cool, but was depositing a fine condensation on the objects nearest to it. The harness hooks, the shelf Lars had built for the boys' things, the corner of the blanket chest when she had pushed it too close during a rearrangement. The south wall showed nothing of the kind. She moved the blanket chest away from the north wall and made a note of the difference, and when the thaw came in April, she began her systematic comparison. Palm on north surface, walk to south surface, palm on south surface, stand still and compare. The difference was not subtle. On a mild March morning with the sun at a low angle, the south wall's exterior was perceptibly warmer to the touch than the surrounding air. The north wall's exterior was indistinguishable from the air itself. The cold was moving through the north wall the way water moves through cloth, not blocked, only slowed, and not slowed enough. She thought about this through April. She thought about it while planting. She thought about it while mending and while feeding the stove and while watching the boys sleep. And the thinking was of the practical variety that does not require paper or privacy, but only a problem clearly held in the mind and turned occasionally, the way you turn a stone in a creek to see what is living beneath it. In May, she began to think about Lars' 3 unfinished courses on the north exterior. He had not told her what he intended to fill the cavity with. He had not told her the precise depth he planned, or how high he meant to carry the outer skin, or how he intended to address the corners where 2 walls met. He had told her only that the north wall needed something more, and then he had laid 3 courses, and the ground had frozen, and the winter had come, and the idea had sat incomplete for a year before the typhoid finished it permanently. She had the 3 courses. She had the beginning of an idea that she could not yet fully see. She had the meadowlark's nest that she would not find until June, which would give her the final piece of the reasoning. And she had the summer to figure out the rest. The nest, when she found it, did not deliver its lesson immediately. That is worth saying plainly, because the story of practical discovery tends to be told as a sequence of illuminations. One observation leads directly to one insight, leads directly to one solution, and the reality is almost never that clean. Sigrid crouched beside the meadowlark's nest in June, felt the warmth inside it with one careful finger, stood up, and went back to work. She did not go home and begin drawing plans. She went home and thought about what the nest had confirmed, which was not a new idea but the correct framing of one she had been circling for months. The nest was warm because the walls stopped the air from moving. Still, air held warmth in a way that moving air could not. This was the principle. She had been trying to see it clearly since March, and the nest gave her the language for it. not words, but a physical demonstration she could return to in her mind whenever the reasoning blurred. She spent July watching how air moved through and around the house. She wet her finger and held it near the baseboard of the north wall on windy days and felt the movement, faint, barely perceptible, but real. Cold air finding its way through pathways in the sod that 4 years of weathering had opened. She wet her finger and held it near the south wall under the same conditions and felt nothing. She stuffed a strip of muslin into the gap where the north wall met the floor and the movement stopped. Then she pulled it out and let it start again. She was learning the house. She was learning what it was doing and where and why, with the thoroughness of a diagnosis, because she understood, with the clarity that a second hard winter was going to provide whether she was ready or not, that a treatment applied without diagnosis was not medicine, but guesswork. By August she knew what she needed to do. The question remaining was how. The design, when it settled into final form, was the result of constraints more than inspiration. She could not build a new exterior wall. The ground was too hard by autumn, and the labor of cutting and hauling fresh sod blocks without Lars and without money to hire help was beyond what she could manage while also running the claim. What she could build was an interior frame set inside the existing wall face, creating a cavity she could pack with material she already had in abundance. The frame would be cottonwood. There was a stand of it in the creek bottom half a mile east, and she had the bow saw Lars had kept oiled on its hook in the lean-to, and she had Eric, who was 9 years old and understood without being told that the work his father had left unfinished was now the work they did together. The cavity depth she determined with her own arm. She pushed her right arm into the air beside the north wall until her elbow touched the sod surface and marked the position of her wrist. That distance, elbow to wrist, roughly 8 inches, was the measurement she used, not because she had calculated an optimal depth, because she needed the grass packed tight enough to compress without air pockets, and her arm told her that 8 inches was the depth she could pack reliably by feel, pressing the material in from the open face before the muslin closed it. The measurement was empirical. It was also, as I understood when she explained it to me years later, correct. But she arrived at it from the inside of the problem, not from theory applied to the problem. The packing material was dry blue-stem grass, cut in August at the end of the dry season when the moisture content was at its lowest and the structural integrity of the grass stalk, the thing that would hold the cavity open and resist compaction over time, was at its strongest. She cut it herself with a scythe, Eric and Tomas raking it into windrows behind her, and she stacked it in a rick beside the north wall that grew large enough over 2 weeks to attract the notice of Berga's wife, who mentioned to Gunderson's wife that the Halverson widow appeared to be preparing for a herd she did not own. What Sigrid was preparing for was January. Construction began on the 1st of September, when the mornings were cool enough that the work did not overheat her, and the evenings were still long enough that she could see by the last light what she had done in the day. The cottonwood felling took 3 days. She chose young, straight-grained trees from the creek stand, none of them wider than 4 inches, and she cut them to length with the bow saw on a pair of sawhorses Lars had built in the first year on the claim. She notched the ends with a hatchet to accept the horizontal rails of the frame. Eric carried the cut pieces from the creek on a sledge he had made by lashing 2 planks to a pair of runners carved from bent willow, a construction he arrived at without being asked, because he had watched his father rig things and had absorbed, without knowing he had absorbed it, the principle that a useful object can generally be made from whatever is at hand. I mention the sledge because it is the kind of detail that does not appear in accounts of frontier construction, and it should. The work was not done by one person, it was done by a woman and a 9-year-old boy and, in the smaller capacities available to a 5-year-old, Tomas, who carried nails from the coffee tin with the seriousness of someone who understood that the nails mattered, even if he did not fully understand why. The frame of the Halverson packed wall was built by 3 people, one of whom could not yet read, and one of whom was not yet tall enough to set the upper rail without standing on an overturned washtub. The frame itself went into the north and west walls first, the walls that faced the weather directly. 8 inches inside the existing sod face, floor to ceiling, cottonwood poles set vertically at 18-inch intervals. The bases driven into the earth floor with a maul and held at the top by a horizontal rail, mortised and pegged in the way Lars had taught her to mortise and peg in the first year of their marriage, when she had helped him build the furniture they could not afford to buy. On the 3rd day of framing, the north face refused to stand plumb. The earth floor near the northwest corner had shifted over the summer. A subtle heave from ground moisture and the pressure of the exterior sod, and the vertical poles in that section leaned 4 degrees toward the interior. It was not a collapse. It was not dramatic. But Sigrid looked at it for a long time because she understood that a frame that was not plumb would compress the packing unevenly and create gaps, and gaps were what she was building against. She pulled the section out. She excavated the earth floor at the base of each pole in that corner, reset the poles in fresh holes, repacked the earth around them with a tamping iron, and re-leveled each one individually with the small spirit level Lars had kept in his carpenter's kit. This took the better part of a day. When it was done, the frame stood plumb. Eric had watched her pull the section out without saying anything. When she finished re-leveling, he ran his eye down the line of poles the way he had seen his father sight a fence line. "It's straight now," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you just leave it?" She handed him the spirit level and let him look through it at the bubble floating in the center of the vial. "Because the grass will pack tight on the high side and loose on the low side. The loose side is where the cold comes in. 4 degrees now is a gap in January." Eric looked at the bubble. He looked at the repaired corner. He handed the level back. He did not ask again why she had pulled it out. By the 3rd week of September, the frame was complete on the north and west walls. The muslin went up in panels, stretched tight over the cottonwood face, and secured with small furniture tacks at 8-inch intervals, tight enough that it would not belly inward under the pressure of the packed grass behind it, but leaving the bottom edge open along each panel so she could feed the grass in from below. The packing itself took 6 days. She pushed the dry blue stem in by the armful, pressing each layer down firmly before adding the next, working upward from the floor in sections. The resistance of the packed grass against her arms told her when the density was right, not rigid, but solid enough that a pushed finger would not penetrate more than an inch without effort. Where she could feel a soft spot, she added more and repacked. Where a panel of muslin bowed outward, she added an intermediate tack to pull it back to plane. On the north wall, she packed the cavity tighter than on the west, a judgment she made on the basis of where the condensation had appeared on the interior surfaces the previous winter. More cold pressure required more resistance. She adjusted the density by feel and by memory. When the last panel of muslin was tacked and the bottom edges sealed with a final strip of cloth folded and pressed into the earth floor, she stood in the middle of the room and looked at what she had built. The room appeared, from the inside, simply smaller. The walls were closer, the ceiling felt lower on the north and west sides, where the frame had consumed 8 inches of floor space. The muslin surface was plain and functional, nothing to look at. She pressed her palm against the north muslin panel and held it there. The surface was cool in the way any interior surface is cool in September. It was not cold in the way the sod wall behind it was cold. The frame and the 8 inches of packed grass and the muslin were already doing something the sod alone had not done. They were separating the inside of the room from the outside of the wall in a way that her palm could feel. She held her hand there for a long time. Then she went outside and began banking the base of the north wall with the sod scraps she had stacked beside the house over the summer, packing them 3 feet high against the exterior foundation, sloping outward to shed water. The ground below the frost line maintained a constant temperature regardless of what the air above it was doing. She was connecting the base of the wall to that stability, giving the cold one less direction from which to enter. She worked until the light was gone. She came back inside and fed the stove and made the boys their supper and sat beside the fire afterward, not reading, not mending, just sitting and listening to the September wind begin its first cold argument with the prairie. The frame was in. The packing was done. Now she needed winter to show her whether she had understood what the meadowlark knew or only thought she had. The first thing October took was the light. Not all at once. The prairie does not do things all at once, which is one of the ways it differs from the mountains and the forests and the other landscapes that announce their changes dramatically and are photographed for that reason. The prairie changes by degrees, each degree small enough that you can almost convince yourself nothing is happening, until you look up one morning and the quality of the light is different in a way you cannot quite name, and the grass has gone from green to bronze to the particular dry gold that means the growing is finished and the accounting has begun. Sigrid noticed the light on the 3rd of October. She was on the south terrace, splitting kindling, and the shadow her axe made when she raised it was longer than it had been the week before, and the angle of it was wrong in the way that only happens when the sun has moved in its arc enough to matter. She finished the kindling and stacked it in the lean-to and looked at the sky for a long moment, making the calculation that every person who winters on the open plains learns to make: how much time remained between now and the first serious cold, and whether what she had was enough. The east and south walls were not yet packed. She had 4 weeks, perhaps 5 if the season was generous, before the first hard freeze would make outdoor work on the frame impractical. The ground would not freeze solid until November, but the mornings would begin to stiffen in mid-October, and cold, stiffened hands do not set cottonwood nails cleanly, and nails set uncleanly hold frames that are adequate until they are not. She had learned this from Lars, who had said it in the specific way of a carpenter who has made the mistake he is warning against. Cold work looks finished until the spring shows you what it actually is. She sharpened the saw that evening and laid out the remaining cottonwood poles in the lean-to where they would stay dry, and she began the east and south walls the following morning. The east wall presented a problem she had not anticipated, which is the nature of construction. The problems you anticipate rarely appear as predicted, and the ones that stop you are the ones you did not think to look for. The east wall of the Halverson house was not, like the north and west walls, a simple uninterrupted face of sod. Lars had set the single window in the east wall, a 12-inch square of glass in a cottonwood frame, positioned to catch the morning light and set 30 inches above the floor. The window was the only glass on the claim. Lars had carried it from Salina wrapped in his spare shirt, on horseback, a journey of 7 miles, and he had spoken about it with the particular care of a man transporting something that cost more than it appeared to cost, and that could not be replaced without considerable difficulty. Sigrid had no intention of covering the window, but the window interrupted the frame. A cottonwood pole run floor to ceiling at the window's position would block the light entirely. A frame built around the window would leave a gap in the packed wall directly at the one point where the sod construction was already compromised. The junction of glass and wood and earth was never as tight as the sod itself, and the cold found it every winter, seeping in around the frame in a way she had always noticed but never fully addressed. She stood in front of the east wall for the better part of a morning, thinking about it. The solution she arrived at was this. She built the frame on the east wall in 2 sections, leaving a gap at the window that she then addressed separately. She constructed a second window frame, cottonwood like the first, but 8 inches proud of the original, and packed the cavity between the 2 frames with short sections of tightly rolled grass tied with strips of cloth, each roll the diameter of her fist, inserted individually and compressed until the entire space between the 2 frames was filled solid. Then she stretched a second piece of muslin across the inner frame, leaving the window itself accessible but surrounded now on all 4 sides by the same packed insulation as the rest of the east wall. The effect was a window set in a deep well of insulated wall, the glass recessed 8 inches from the interior surface. The morning light, when it came through, fell across the floor at a different angle than before, lower, more oblique, traveling further through the well before it reached the room. But it came through, and the cold that had previously seeped around the original frame was stopped by the new one. She tested it the way she tested everything, with her hand. She pressed her palm against the cottonwood of the inner frame on the first cold night of October and felt nothing she needed to fear. Eric, watching her test it, ran his own hand along the inner frame and then looked at the original window, now recessed behind it. "It's like a tunnel," he said. "Yes," Sigrid said, "a tunnel with grass in the walls." He thought about this. Is that why the cold can't get through? Because the tunnel is too long? It was close enough to the principle that she did not correct it. "Something like that," she said. The south wall she finished in the second week of October, working faster now because the method was familiar and her hands had learned what they were doing. The packed wall had its own muscle memory by then. The particular compression of a well-packed section, the slightly hollow sound of a palm slapped against a section that needed more grass, the satisfying density of one that did not. She moved along the south face in a single continuous effort, not stopping to assess individual sections, but reading them as she went, adjusting by feel the way a baker adjusts dough by touch rather than by watching the clock. On the 12th of October, she sealed the last panel of muslin on the south wall and tacked the bottom edge to the earth floor and stood back. The room was noticeably smaller than it had been in September. The packed walls had consumed 8 inches on all 4 faces, reducing the interior from 14 feet square to something closer to 12.5. The ceiling, which had never been generous, felt lower. The window in the east wall was a rectangle of gray Oktobersk at the end of its grass-lined tunnel. The stove in the center of the room was the same stove, throwing the same heat, but the room it was throwing it into was different in a way that was difficult to articulate and very easy to feel. Sigrid did not feel it immediately because she had been working hard and her body was warm from the labor. She felt it an hour later when she had cooled down and the boys were asleep and she was sitting beside a fire banked low for the night. The stove was doing less work than usual. She had not added wood as early as she normally would, and the room was the same temperature it always was at this hour. She did not add the wood. She sat and watched the fire and waited to see how long the room held its temperature without it. It held for 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, with the fire reduced to coals, the room was cooler, but not cold. She added wood then, less than her usual amount, and the temperature recovered in 20 minutes. She sat until midnight, conducting this experiment without calling it that, and when she finally lay down, she knew 2 things she had not known with certainty that morning. The packed walls were working, and the stove, which had always been adequate for burning and never quite adequate for warming, was now in a different negotiation with the room it inhabited. She lay on her side in the dark and listened to the prairie wind move against the exterior sod and thought, "Good, let it come." It came on the 19th of October, which was earlier than most years and which the older settlers received with a particular kind of quiet. Not panic, but the focused attention of people who have learned that the prairie makes its own schedule and that the correct response to an early winter is not complaint, but acceleration. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in 6 hours on the afternoon of the 19th. By evening, the sky had the dense gray quality that means the cold is not visiting but moving in, and by the following morning there was a skin of ice on the water barrel in the lean-to that had not been there the day before. Sigrid broke the ice in the barrel and carried water inside, and fed the stove, and made the boys their breakfast, and thought carefully about what remained to be done before January made the question academic. The door. She had known about the door since August and had been putting it off, not because she doubted the necessity, but because it was the most complex piece of the work, and she had wanted the walls fully complete before she addressed it. The door was the largest single gap in the thermal envelope she had built. Every time it opened, it admitted a column of outside air, the full height and width of the frame, replacing the warmed interior air with whatever the prairie was offering at that moment. The walls she had packed could not compensate for a door that was losing the argument 20 times a day. Lars's door was a single thickness of cottonwood planks, battened and hung on iron hinges, with a leather latch and a gap at the sill that she had chinked with rags every winter and re-chinked when the rags compressed and the gap returned. It was a door built for a moderate climate by a man who had not yet fully understood that Kansas was not moderate. It was better than nothing. It was not, in the winter that was arranging itself outside, going to be enough. She built a second door frame inside the first. The construction was simpler than the wall frames. 4 pieces of cottonwood, mortised at the corners, set 4 inches proud of the original frame, with a curtain of braided grass hanging from the top rail that reached the floor and could be pushed aside to pass through. The 4-inch airspace between the 2 frames was not packed. She left it open because a sealed airspace at the door would make the entrance impassable, and because 4 inches of still air, she had reasoned from the meadowlark's principle, was enough to take the edge off the cold before it entered the room proper. The grass curtain was Tomas's contribution, though he did not know it. She had found him one afternoon sitting on the floor of the lean-to braiding lengths of dry grass into a rope, with the focused incomprehension of a 5-year-old who is doing something because his hands want to and not because he has a purpose in mind. She looked at what he had made, 3 feet of braided grass, surprisingly tight, surprisingly strong. And she took it inside and held it across the doorframe and saw immediately what it could do, and she asked him to make more. He made more with the enthusiasm of a child who has been told that his purposeless activity has a purpose, and she joined the sections together with cloth ties until she had a curtain 6 feet tall and the full width of the door. It hung better than she had expected. The weight of it kept it flat against the frame. A person pushing through it displaced it, and it fell back immediately, sealing the entrance again without requiring any action on the person's part. She pushed through it herself a dozen times on the day she hung it, testing the fall, adjusting the ties where the curtain bunched at the top. By the end of the afternoon, it opened and closed with the reliable passivity of something that has been correctly designed. Tomas pushed through it repeatedly for the rest of the day, for no reason other than that he could. The last week of October brought 3 days of hard rain that turned the clay soil of the claim into a surface that held a boot print like wax holds a seal, and released it with a sound like something being torn. Sigrid used the rain days for interior work, rehanging the harness hooks on the new muslin wall face, repositioning the blanket chest away from the north wall as a habit she no longer needed but kept anyway, resealing the base edges of the muslin panels where the earth floor had shifted slightly in the wet. On the 3rd day of rain, she went outside in her oilskin to check the banking along the north and west exterior. The banked sod had held, but the slope she had created to shed water was compressing under the weight of the rain, and 2 sections had flattened enough that water was pooling against the wall base rather than running away from it. She rebuilt the slope with additional sod scraps from the pile she had kept beside the house for exactly this possibility, tamping the new material into the existing bank and angling it more steeply than before. She worked in the rain for 2 hours, her oilskin adequate across the shoulders but useless at the hem, and when she came inside, her boots left dark prints across the earth floor that followed her directly to the stove without deviation, because she had learned at some point in the past year not to hesitate between the cold and the fire. November arrived with a sky the color of an iron skillet and a wind that had shed whatever restraint October had asked of it. The temperature on the first morning of November was 18 degrees at dawn and did not reach 30 by midday. The grass in the fields had gone the color of old bone. The creek in the bottom had a shelf of ice along both banks that grew an inch a day and would meet in the middle by December. Sigrid fed the stove and noted, for the first time with genuine confidence rather than careful hope, that the amount of wood she was burning to maintain the room's temperature was less than what she had burned the previous November. Not dramatically less, not the difference between hardship and comfort, the difference between a fire that was working to catch up and a fire that was working to maintain. The room was holding what the stove put into it in a way it had not held it before. She did not tell Gunderson this when she came to the store in the second week of November for cornmeal and lamp oil. She did not tell Marta Christensen, who stopped to speak with her at the store and asked, with the genuine concern of a woman who had watched Sigrid's first winter alone with the attention she gave to all things that might require action, whether she was prepared. "I think so," Sigrid said. Marta looked at her. Marta had known Sigrid for 4 years and understood that "I think so" from Sigrid was not modesty but precision, the statement of a woman who did not claim more certainty than her evidence justified. "What have you done differently?" Marta asked. "I packed the walls," Sigrid said. Marta waited for more. More did not come. She let the subject rest, because she was a woman who understood the difference between privacy and secrecy, and what Sigrid carried had the quality of the former. Burge was at the counter when this exchange took place. He heard it. He said nothing because there was nothing in those 3 words, "I packed the walls," that he knew what to do with, and he was not a man who spoke into gaps he could not fill. He thought about it on the ride home. He thought about the grass rick he had seen beside the Halverson house in September. He thought about Sigrid's hand on the north wall in March, and her answer when he had told her the obvious thing about why south walls were warmer than north ones, and the particular quality of her attention when she had declined to be satisfied with the obvious. He did not ride over to ask about it. He was not ready to ask about it. January would make him ready. The freeze arrived without announcement, which is the way the worst things arrive. There was no single morning when Saline County woke and understood that this winter was different from the ones before it. There was instead an accumulation, a week of temperatures that did not recover during the day the way temperatures are supposed to recover, a wind that had stopped varying in direction and was now simply north, always north, with the consistency of something that had made a decision. The creek in the bottom froze solid on the 3rd of January, not just at the banks but across its full width, and the ice was clear and deep and made no sound when you walked on it, which is how you know ice is serious. Thin ice speaks. Ice that means to stay is silent. By the 6th of January, the temperature had dropped to a place where the older settlers stopped giving numbers and started giving descriptions instead because numbers seemed inadequate. A man's breath froze before it dispersed. Nails left outside overnight would raise a blister on ungloved fingers. The sound of the wind had changed its register, higher, thinner, with a persistence that wore at the mind the way water wears at stone, not by force, but by continuity. I could not ride. I want to say that plainly, because it is sometimes omitted from accounts of that winter, in the interest of making the doctor appear more capable than the weather. I was 40 years old and in good health, and I had a good horse, and I could not ride for 12 days in January of 1878. The cold was not the primary obstacle. The wind was. A man on horseback in that wind, 7 miles from shelter on the open plain, was not a doctor making his rounds. He was a body waiting to be found in the spring. I kept records from what reached me. I kept them in the particular way of a man who cannot act and so documents instead, because documentation is the only form of usefulness available to him. A family in the northern part of the county lost their roof on the 9th. The cottonwood poles, improperly sized for the span, cracked under the weight of drifted snow, and the whole mass came down in the night. They survived under the fallen sod for 4 days before a neighbor found them. The 2 elderly men I have mentioned, one was found on the 11th, one on the 14th. Berge lost 9 cattle and his milk cow to the cold. Gunderson's store, which was the most solidly built structure in the immediate area, maintained an interior temperature of 34 degrees on the coldest nights with its stove running full. 34 degrees, with a commercial iron stove and a frame building that had been constructed with more care than most. On the 22nd of January, the temperature rose to 8 degrees above zero, which was the first time in 11 days it had been above zero at all, and I saddled my horse and rode northwest. The Halverson claim appeared from the road, as it always appeared, the low profile of the sod house against the flat horizon, the lean-to at the east end, the bare cottonwoods along the creek bottom marking the distance to the water. Smoke from the stovepipe moving nearly horizontal in the diminished but still considerable wind. Nothing to distinguish it from any other claim in the county except that it was there and intact, and the smoke was moving the way smoke moves from a fire that is burning at a normal rate, rather than the desperate rate of a stove being pushed to its limit. Eric met me at the fence line. He was wearing his coat and hat and his father's work gloves, which were too large for him and had been folded back at the cuff. He took my horse's bridle while I dismounted, and he said, before I could ask anything, "Everyone is fine. Mama said you'd come when it broke." The interior temperature was 47 degrees. I have written that number before, and I will write it once more because it is the number the story turns on, and numbers of this kind should not be allowed to pass too quickly. 47 degrees Fahrenheit inside a sod house on a January day when the outside temperature was 8 above zero. A differential of 39 degrees between the air inside and the air outside, maintained by a standard iron stove burning cottonwood at a rate that Sigrid described when I asked, as her normal rate, the same quantity of wood she burned on a cold evening in October. I tapped my thermometer against my palm. I held it near the stove to confirm it was reading correctly. It read higher near the stove, as it should. I moved to the center of the room, away from the stove's direct influence, and read it again. 47 degrees. I pressed my palm against the north muslin wall. The surface was cool, not warm, not the dramatic warmth of a heated stone, but cool in the way a room is cool when it has been lived in at a reasonable temperature, not cold in the way that surface had been cold the February I had visited the previous year, when it had been conducting the outside into the room with the directness of a pipeline. Sigrid poured coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from me with the composed attention of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation and has decided in advance how she wants to have it. She was thinner than she had been in October. Winter on the claim had its costs, and she paid them without complaint. But the thinness was the leanness of work, not the hollowness of deprivation. Her eyes had the quality I had come to recognize in people who have done a difficult thing and know they have done it correctly. Not triumph, but the quieter and more durable satisfaction of a conclusion confirmed. I asked her about the east wall crack first, because Gunderson had told me there had been a problem, and I wanted to understand it before she did. "The 6th, she said. The worst night. The banking on the east base had compressed in the cold, and there was air moving through the gap between the bank and the wall sill. I could feel it on the floor. What did you do?" "I went outside and repacked it." I looked at her. "On the 6th of January. The crack was on the east base. The east wall faces away from the wind. It was manageable." I did not ask what manageable meant at negative 15 degrees in the dark, because I understood that her definition of manageable and mine were calibrated to different instruments. I asked instead about the boys, and she called them from the sleeping area, and I examined them both. Eric composed and cooperative, Tomas vibrating with the energy of a child who has been inside for 11 days and is ready to be outside again. Both were well. Neither showed the respiratory symptoms I had been treating across the county in children who had spent the winter in houses that were cold enough to weaken lungs without being cold enough to make adults take the warning seriously. I told her the thermometer reading. I told her about the roof collapse and the 2 elderly men and Berge's cattle. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How warm was Gunderson's store?" she asked. 34 on the coldest nights, I said, with his stove running full. She nodded slowly, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the expression of a person checking a calculation against a known value. 34 in a well-built frame structure with a commercial stove. 47 in a sod house with a standard stove. The difference was 13 degrees and it was sitting in the walls. The meadowlark, I said, because I wanted to understand from the beginning. She told me. The nest in June, the warm interior, the principle she had derived from it, and the north wall observation, and Lars's 3 unfinished courses, and the elbow measurement, and the grass that had been lying in her fields since before she arrived on the claim. She told it without embellishment, in the sequential way of a person recounting a process rather than a revelation, because that is what it had been, a process, not a moment. I held my hand against the north wall while she talked and listened to the wind work at the exterior sod, and felt, through the muslin and the 8 inches of packed blue stem and the original 2-foot wall beyond it, almost nothing at all. You've made the wall deep enough that the cold runs out of force before it gets through, I said. The grass stops the air from moving, she said. Still, air doesn't carry cold the way moving air does. That's all it is. That's all it is. I have thought about that phrase many times in the years since because it contains, in 4 words, the particular modesty of genuine practical intelligence, the willingness to describe a solution in terms of its mechanism rather than its difficulty, which requires that you actually understand the mechanism rather than simply being grateful that it works. The story reached Gunderson's store before the end of January, carried there by the slow resumption of travel as the freeze broke and people began to emerge and compare what the winter had taken from them. Gunderson told it the way he told everything useful, as information, not gossip, with the specific details intact and the speculative elements clearly labeled. The resistance came first, as it always does. Burge heard it at the counter and said that packed grass in a wall cavity sounded like something that would work in October and fail in January, and that if the Halverson widow's house had stayed warm, it was more likely owing to the size of the stove than to anything she had done with grass and muslin. He said this with the confidence of a man who has 9 dead cattle in his pens and needs, for reasons that have nothing to do with logic, to believe that what he would have done differently would have been the wrong thing anyway. Gunderson let him finish. Then he told him about my thermometer reading. Berge was quiet for a long moment. 47, he said. 47, Gunderson confirmed. Dr. Marsh tapped the thermometer twice. Berg asked, after another silence, what kind of nails she had used for the cottonwood frame. He asked it in the careful voice of a man who has decided to move from one position to another and is doing so without announcing the movement. Gunderson told him what Sigrid had bought. Berge nodded and bought the same. He came to see the walls himself in February with 2 other men, and Sigrid showed them the inspection port she had cut in the south wall, a small section of muslin folded back to reveal the packed grass cavity, the density of it, the way it held its shape without compression after 4 months. He pressed his fingers into the exposed grass and felt the resistance of it. He measured the cavity depth with his thumb and forefinger. He asked about the window framing and the door curtain and the east wall banking, and Sigrid answered each question with the patience of a person who understands that a question asked seriously deserves a serious answer regardless of what the questioner said in October. He did not say he had been wrong. He asked 11 questions, and the questions said it for him. Marta Christensen came on a Thursday, alone, and stayed 3 hours. She did not measure or inspect. She sat at the table and drank her coffee and looked at the room, the smaller dimensions, the muslin walls, the tunnel of the east window, the braided grass curtain at the door, with the steady attention she gave to things she intended to understand fully. She asked about the south wall moisture handling, which was a question I had not thought to ask, and which told me, when Gunderson relayed it later, that Marta had already begun to think about her own walls. Before she left, she stood in the center of the room and was quiet for a moment. "Lars started something," she said, "on the north exterior. 3 courses, Sigrid said. I built from them." Marta looked at the north wall, the muslin surface, plain and functional, concealing the 8 inches of packed grass and the original sod beyond it, and beneath the sod on the exterior face, Lars's 3 courses of unfinished work incorporated into the bank. She did not say anything else about it. She put on her coat and hat and pushed through the grass curtain and went home. By summer, 4 families in the Norwegian community had begun packing their walls. By the following winter, the technique had moved through the female network of the county, carried at seed exchanges and summer gatherings by women who lived inside the houses all day and knew precisely where the cold came from and what it cost, to the German families in the eastern sections and to several American homesteaders who had been burning more wood than they could afford for 8 years and were willing to try anything that a thermometer confirmed. Gunderson ordered extra bolts of muslin in July without being asked. He had done the arithmetic. The technique does not carry Sigrid Halvorson's name. I looked in the years after I left Saline County and found the principle described in extension circulars and building guides without attribution, instructions for packing wall cavities with dry fibrous material, presented as received wisdom with no origin given, received from whom the circulars do not say. The knowledge had traveled far enough from its source that the source was no longer visible. I am setting the source down here as precisely as I can because I was in that room with my thermometer on the 22nd of January, 1878. And I know where it came from. It came from a woman who ran her hand along a cold wall in March and decided that understanding why it was cold was the necessary step before deciding what to do about it. It came from a meadowlark's nest in June, and 8 weeks of watching the way air moved through a house that had been built well and had become, through no fault of its builder, no longer adequate. It came from a 9-year-old boy holding cottonwood poles and a 5-year-old braiding grass into rope because his hands wanted to. When I said goodbye to Sigrid Halvorson in the spring of 1889, before I left Saline County for Topeka, I asked her what she thought about when she thought about that winter. She considered the question for a moment in the way she considered all questions that were worth considering. "I think about the bucket," she said. I asked her which morning, the first morning the bucket had not frozen, or the mornings before when she had broken the ice with the hatchet. "Both," she said. "You need both. The mornings when it froze told me what I was solving. The morning it didn't told me I had solved it." I rode south toward Salina and then east toward Topeka, and I thought about that for a long time. The mornings when it froze, the morning it didn't. The hatchet on the nail by the door, kept there from habit through a winter that no longer required it, because the woman who built those walls was not the kind of person who discards the evidence of what she has come through. The bucket did not freeze. The boys did not shake. In a county that lost cattle and rooftops and 2 old men to a January that had decided to be serious, a woman who had spent a summer watching a meadowlark's nest held 47 degrees with a standard stove and a room full of still air, and the 3 courses her husband had laid before the ground froze, and the work stopped. That is the whole of it. That is enough.